most people think they know the story of the French Revolution. It was the catastrophic collapse of a national financial Ponzi scheme where the Bourbon monarchy had been borrowing against a future that it could no longer afford to sustain. He was, in a very real sense, the world's first financial influencer. In 1781, he performed an act of political theater that was completely unprecedented in the history of absolute monarchy. He published the Compte Rendu au Roi, which was the first public report of the royal finances. For the first time in history, the average person on the street could see how much money the king was making and how that money was being spent. It was an instant bestseller, with over 20,000 copies sold in the first few weeks. But there was a dark secret hidden within the pages of this famous report. Necker had masterfully cooked the books. To maintain the confidence of international lenders, he presented a version of the French budget that showed a surplus of 10 million livres. However, he achieved this number by a massive accounting trick. He separated the ordinary expenses of the government from the extraordinary expenses of the war. To understand why hundreds of thousands of people died and a 1,000-year-old empire was erased, you should not look at the bayonets. He left out the massive costs of the American Revolution and the staggering interest payments on old debts. To the public, Necker appeared to be a miracle worker. They believed he had found a way to fund a global war and run a kingdom without raising taxes on the poor. He became the most popular man in France, a celebrity savior who was seen as the only one capable of standing up to the greedy nobility. But to the few people who actually understood the math, Necker was a dangerous gambler. By falsifying the national balance sheet, he had lured international investors into a false sense of security. Because of his report, the Dutch and Swiss banks continued to pour millions of livres into the French treasury, thinking their investment was safe. In reality, Necker was just buying time. He was using his personal brand and his reputation for transparency to hide a bankruptcy that was already in progress. When the reality of the deficit finally began to leak out, the betrayal was felt even more deeply. Instead, you need to look at the dusty ledgers in the backrooms of private banks in Geneva and London. The public, who had been told that everything was fine, suddenly realized they were standing on a hollowed-out foundation. Necker's deception didn't just delay the crisis. It ensured that when the crash finally came, it would be catastrophic. The first financial influencer had successfully sold the French people a lie, and the cost of that lie would eventually be paid in blood on the streets of Paris. While the French government was drowning in sovereign debt, a second disaster was unfolding that would gut the nation's economy from the inside out. In 1786, the French monarchy signed a trade agreement with Great Britain known as the Eden Treaty. On the surface, the logic seemed sound to the economic thinkers of the time. The goal was to lower tariffs between the two rivals, allowing France to export its world-class wines and luxury goods to London, while Great Britain exported its manufactured goods to Paris. But in reality, this treaty was an act of economic suicide. At this exact moment in history, Great Britain was in the early, explosive stages of the Industrial Revolution. British factories were already using steam power and advanced machinery to produce textiles and iron goods at a speed and cost that the rest of the world could not match. You need to understand how sovereign debt was weaponized, how financial reports were falsified to deceive international creditors, and how an early central banking crisis pushed an entire nation into a hyperinflationary abyss. France, however, was still largely a nation of manual laborers and small-scale artisans. By opening the borders to free trade, the French monarchy was essentially inviting a high-tech superpower to compete against a medieval workforce. The result was immediate and devastating. Cheap, high-quality British textiles flooded the French market, and the domestic industry collapsed almost overnight. In industrial centers, like Rouen and Lyon, thousands of French looms went silent. Tens of thousands of skilled workers were thrown out of their jobs, unable to compete with the sheer efficiency of British machines. This created a new and dangerous class of people, the urban unemployed. These were not just hungry peasants from the countryside. These were angry, educated artisans in the cities who had lost everything because of a government policy they did not understand. To the French people, the Eden Treaty felt like a betrayal. Starving peasants can start a riot, but only a shattered financial system can fuel a revolution that rewrites the world order. They watched as their livelihoods were sacrificed to satisfy the interests of the wine-producing nobility who benefited from the exports to London. This was the French version of the Tariff of Abominations. It was a wealth transfer that enriched the landowning elite while destroying the middle and working classes of the cities. By 1788, the economic situation reached a breaking point. A series of poor harvests led to a spike in bread prices, but it was the Eden Treaty that had already removed the safety net of steady employment. When people can no longer afford to buy bread, it is a crisis. But when they can no longer find work to earn the money for bread, it is a revolution. The Eden Treaty acted as a Trojan horse, hollowed out the French manufacturing base, and created the very mob that would eventually march on Versailles. The monarchy had hoped that free trade would modernize the country and generate new tax revenue to pay off their massive debts. Instead, they had accidentally created an army of the unemployed with nothing left to lose. In the months leading up to 1789, the greatest enemy of King Louis XVI was not the mob outside his palace. It was the compound interest on massive loans taken out to fund global wars. The economic Cold War with Britain had moved from the battlefield to the marketplace, and by 1789 the French economy was a hollow shell, waiting for a single spark to set the entire structure on fire. If you want to find the true architects of 1789, you should not look at the philosophers in the cafes of Paris. You should look at the banking houses of Geneva and the merchant firms of London. By the late 1780s, the French crown no longer owned its own sovereignty. It had been sold, piece by piece, to a network of international creditors who held the ultimate power, the power to say no. This is the part of the story that historians often overlook because it involves a complex web of religion and finance. The French monarchy was the primary defender of the Catholic Church. Yet, the people who were keeping the monarchy alive were a small, elite circle of Protestant bankers from Switzerland. Men like Jacques Necker were part of a global financial network that operated across borders and owed no true loyalty to the French throne. To these bankers, the Kingdom of France was not a sacred land, it was a portfolio. This was not a simple fight between the rich and the poor. By 1787, these international lenders had realized that the French state was trapped in a death spiral of interest. Every new loan was being used simply to pay off the interest on the previous loan. This is the exact definition of a Ponzi scheme. The bankers knew that if something did not change, a total sovereign default was inevitable. And in the world of high finance, a default is the one thing you cannot allow. The bankers began to use their financial leverage to force political change. They understood that an absolute monarch was a terrible credit risk. A king could decide on a whim to stop paying his debts, and there was no legal court that could stop him. But a constitutional government, like the one in Great Britain, was a much safer bet. If the people through a parliament were responsible for the debt, they would be more likely to raise the taxes needed to pay it back. It was a collision between a decaying feudal system and a new, hungry capitalist class that understood that whoever controlled the debt controlled the state itself. This is the hidden reason why the call for the Estates General became so loud. It was not just a demand for democracy from the people. It was a demand for security from the creditors. The international banks essentially told King Louis XVI that the tap was running dry. They would not provide any more liquidity unless he agreed to share power with a representative body that could guarantee the repayment of the loans. The Swiss connection was the bridge between the gold in the vaults and the fire in the streets. These financiers funded the printing of revolutionary pamphlets and supported the political rise of the Third Estate because they wanted a more stable, predictable system of debt management. They did not want to destroy France, they wanted to audit it. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They believed they could control the forces of social unrest they were unleashing. I want to put you in a brutal situation in the year 1788. They thought they were simply performing a corporate restructuring of the French state. They did not realize that once the financial foundation of an empire is cracked, the entire building will fall, and it will crush the bankers and the kings alike. While the international bankers were tightening the noose around the neck of the French treasury, an even more bitter war was being fought inside the palace walls. This was a civil war within the ruling class. On one side stood the king's ministers, who realized that the state would collapse without a total overhaul of the tax system. On the other side stood the French nobility and the high clergy, the 2% of the population who owned nearly half of the nation's wealth but paid almost zero in direct taxes. In 1787, the new Controller General of Finance, Charles Alexandre de Colonial, came to a desperate conclusion. He realized that the old system of squeezing the peasants was exhausted. There was simply no more blood to be taken from that stone. To save the monarchy, he proposed a revolutionary idea, a universal land tax. Your government is carrying a debt so massive that every single tax coin you pay goes directly to foreign banks just to cover the interest. This tax would be paid by everyone, including the nobility and the church. No exceptions, no loopholes. To get this plan passed, Colonial bypassed the traditional courts and summoned an assembly of notables. These were 144 of the most powerful men in France. Colonial laid out the brutal truth. The deficit was nearly 100 million livres, and the only way to avoid a total bankruptcy was for the rich to start paying their fair share. But the nobility responded with a level of defiance that shocked the crown. They did not just refuse to pay. They turned the language of the Enlightenment against the king. They argued that they could not be taxed without their consent, and they claimed that only a meeting of the Estates General, a representative body that had not met in 175 years, had the legal authority to approve such a massive change. If you ask anyone on the street, you will get a polished cinematic narrative, a starving peasantry, a detached monarchy, and a queen who supposedly told the poor to eat cake. The currency in your pocket is losing value by the hour because of reckless paper money policies. It was a masterclass in political hypocrisy. The nobility were not defending the liberty of the French people, they were defending their own financial immunity. In many ways, this was the 18th century version of modern corporate tax evasion. The elite used their control of the legal system, specifically the high courts known as the parliaments, to block any legislation that threatened their wealth. They were willing to let the entire nation slide into a catastrophic default rather than surrender their ancient privileges. This stalemate was the final nail in the coffin for the absolute monarchy. King Louis XVI found himself in an impossible position. He was an absolute ruler who could not actually rule his own elite. By refusing to pay, the nobility had effectively gone on a tax strike against their own king. They believed they could use the crisis to weaken the king's power and regain the influence they had lost under Louis XIV. You are standing at a crossroads. They made a fatal miscalculation. By insisting on the calling of the Estates General to resolve the tax dispute, they opened a door that could never be closed. They invited the Third Estate, the lawyers, the merchants, and the workers, into the halls of power, thinking they could control them. But the fire of revolution does not distinguish between a king and a duke. The nobility had successfully defeated the tax collector, but in doing so, they had destroyed the only shield that protected them from the fury of the masses. The tax war of 1787 was the moment the French elite chose their own bank accounts over the survival of the state, and that choice would eventually cost many of them their heads. By late 1789, the Bastille had fallen and the National Assembly had seized control of the government. But the revolutionaries quickly discovered a terrifying truth. Liberty did not pay the bills. The massive sovereign debt that had broken the king was now their problem, and the international bankers were even more hesitant to lend money to a group of unproven radicals. The new government was staring into a fiscal abyss. On one side, you can stay loyal to a bankrupt monarchy for the sake of stability. To save the revolution from immediate bankruptcy, they decided to launch the greatest financial experiment in human history. They decided to monetize the earth itself. The Catholic Church in France was the single largest landowner in the kingdom, holding approximately 10% of all property. In November of 1789, the Assembly voted to seize all church lands and declare them national property. But they couldn't simply sell off tens of thousands of farms and cathedrals overnight without crashing the real estate market. Instead, they issued a new financial instrument called the Assignat. Originally, the assignat was intended to be a bond, a piece of paper that earned interest and could be used to purchase nationalized land at a future auction. It was supposed to be a safe, land-backed security, but the temptation of the printing press proved too strong. Within a year, the government began to issue assignats in small denominations and declared them to be legal tender. On the other, you can choose to burn the entire system to the ground, erasing all debt but risking a bloody and uncertain future. They had transformed a land bond into a paper currency. This was the birth of a massive inflationary bubble. Because the government was desperate to fund its operations and pay off old debts, it began to print assignats at a staggering rate. They told the public that the currency was as good as gold because it was backed by the value of the seized land. But there was a fundamental flaw in this logic. The government was printing paper much faster than it was actually selling the land. By 1792, the market was flooded with billions of livres worth of paper. As the supply of assignats exploded, their value compared to gold and silver plummeted. This was the 18th century version of hyperinflation. Prices for basic goods like bread and fuel began to spiral out of control. A loaf of bread that cost a few sous in 1789 now cost hundreds of assignats. If you were there, which path would you choose? The economic consequences were catastrophic for the poor. Peasants in the countryside refused to sell their grain for what they called worthless scraps of paper. They began to hoard food, waiting for a return to hard currency. In the cities, workers found that their wages, paid in depreciating assignats, could no longer buy enough food to survive. The government tried to fix the problem by passing the law of the general maximum, which set a legal limit on prices and mandated the death penalty for anyone who refused to accept assignats at face value. The revolution had turned the currency into a weapon of state terror. The assignat was no longer a financial tool. It was a loyalty test. If you refused to believe in the value of the paper, you were an enemy of the people. But you cannot execute your way out of a currency collapse. By the time the assignat was finally abandoned in 1796, it was worth less than 1% of its original face value. If you would vote to tear it all down and start over, comment the word destroy. The assignat experiment was a massive wealth transfer. It allowed the government to stay afloat by effectively stealing the purchasing power of every person who held the currency. While wealthy speculators used the depreciated paper to buy up vast tracts of land at a fraction of their true value, the working class was left holding a mountain of worthless paper. The revolution that promised equality had created a new financial elite on the ruins of a broken currency. The paper gold bubble didn't just fund the war, it hollowed out the French economy and ensured that the struggle for survival would continue long after the king was gone. To understand why the French Revolution became a global catastrophe, we must look far beyond the borders of Europe. The financial heart of the French Empire was not in Paris or Versailles. It was located 4,000 miles away in the Caribbean, on a small island colony called Saint-Domingue. Today we know it as Haiti, but in 1789, it was the most profitable piece of real estate on the entire planet. Saint-Domingue was the engine that powered the French Atlantic economy. This single colony produced 40% of the world's sugar and nearly half of its coffee. If you would try to save the system to avoid the chaos of war, comment the word keep. The wealth generated by the brutal labor of over 500,000 enslaved Africans on this island was staggering. It funded the grand architecture of port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes. It provided the tax revenue that allowed the French monarchy to keep up the appearance of a superpower. Most importantly, this colonial wealth was the primary collateral that French merchants used to secure loans from international banks. When the revolution erupted in 1789, it created a massive ideological and economic paradox. The National Assembly had published the Declaration of the Rights of Man, asserting that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. But the French revolutionary government was also a collection of pragmatists, who understood that their new republic was standing on a financial knife edge. If they actually applied those rights to the colonies and abolished slavery, the French economy would vanish overnight. The merchants of the Third Estate, who were the driving force of the revolution, were the same men whose fortunes were tied to the slave trade and sugar plantations. This created a profound hypocrisy at the core of the new government. Be honest with your choice, because the economic collapse of 18th century France looks a lot more like our modern debt crisis than you might think. For years, the revolutionaries in Paris debated whether the rights of man extended to people of color, while simultaneously sending troops to ensure that the sugar continued to flow. They were trapped between their Enlightenment ideals and the cold reality of their balance sheets. The breaking point came in 1791, when the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue launched a massive, coordinated uprising. This was not just a local revolt, it was a direct hit to the jugular of the French financial system. As the plantations burned, the primary source of French hard currency evaporated. The loss of Saint-Domingue meant that the already fragile Assignat currency lost its last shred of international credibility. The Haitian Revolution forced France into a desperate choice. They could no longer rely on colonial profits to fund their wars against the monarchies of Europe. This financial void pushed the French Republic toward even more radical measures, including the mass confiscation of property from any citizen deemed an enemy of the state and the aggressive looting of conquered territories in Italy and the Netherlands. The French Revolution was never just a domestic class war. Now, let us go back to where this story really begins. It was the violent disintegration of an Atlantic imperial system that was built on the foundation of forced labor and international debt. When the sugar and slave engine failed, the revolution was forced to turn inward and feed on its own people to survive. The blood of the guillotine in Paris was inextricably linked to the fire in the sugar fields of the Caribbean, proving that a nation built on the economic exploitation of others will eventually find its own foundations consumed by the same flames. We are often told that the French Revolution was caused by a simple lack of bread. The story goes that a freak hailstorm in 1788 and a bitter winter destroyed the harvests, leading to a famine that drove the people to madness. But this explanation ignores a fundamental truth of economics. A bad harvest is a natural disaster, but a famine is almost always a policy failure. The hunger that gripped France in 1789 was not just a result of the weather. It was a derivative of a collapsed market and a total breakdown of the national supply chain. To understand the bread riots, we have to look back to 1774, when King Louis XVI appointed a man named Anne Robert Jacques Turgot as his finance minister. Turgot was a pioneer of free market thinking, not at the Bastille, but inside the private office of Jacques Necker, where the falsified numbers on a single sheet of paper were about to trigger the most significant bloodbath in human history. He believed that the best way to ensure a steady food supply was to remove all government regulations on the grain trade. At the time, France had a complex system of local price controls and bans on moving grain from one province to another. Turgot abolished these rules, believing that competition would lower prices. But his timing was catastrophic. His liberalization policy coincided with a poor harvest, and instead of prices going down, they skyrocketed as merchants moved grain to wherever they could get the highest price. This led to the Flour War of 1775, a series of massive riots that required military intervention. Although Turgot was eventually fired, the damage to the public trust was permanent. The people became convinced that free trade was simply a conspiracy by the elite to starve the poor for profit. By 1788, this fear became a reality through the lens of financial speculation. Because the French currency was failing and the national debt was exploding, grain became more than just food. It became a hard asset. We are told the Bastille was stormed for the sake of liberty, and the guillotine was the ultimate tool of justice against an outdated feudal regime. To understand the explosion of 1789, we must first look at the massive cracks in the foundation of the French state that were decades in the making. Wealthy speculators and even some government officials began to hoard grain, not to eat it, but to use it as a hedge against inflation. They were betting that the price would continue to rise, and by keeping grain off the market, they ensured that it did. When the government finally tried to intervene by setting a maximum price for bread, they made the situation even worse. Farmers refused to bring their grain to the cities because the legal price was lower than the cost of production. A massive black market emerged, where bread was available only to those who could pay in gold or silver. The poor, who were forced to use the depreciating paper Assignats, found themselves standing in lines for hours, only to find the bakery shelves empty. This is the hidden mechanics of the bread crisis. It was a market failure driven by a lack of confidence in the state. The hunger was the physical manifestation of a broken financial system. When the women of Paris marched on Versailles in October of 1789, they were not just demanding food, they were demanding an end to the speculation and the corruption of the market. The financial death spiral of the French monarchy did not begin with Louis XVI. They understood, perhaps better than the economists, that a government that could not stabilize its currency could never hope to feed its people. The bread crisis was the final proof that the Bourbon monarchy had lost the ability to manage the most basic contract of civilization, the exchange of labor for survival. By 1799, France was exhausted. 10 years of revolution, hyperinflation, and civil war had left the country's infrastructure in ruins and its middle class decimated. The Directory, the government that followed the terror, was infamous for its corruption and its total inability to pay the army. When Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, he understood that his survival depended on more than just military glory. He needed to solve the economic riddle that had destroyed both Louis XVI and the radical revolutionaries. He needed to perform a total restructuring of the French state. Napoleon's first major economic act was the creation of the Bank of France in the year 1800. This was a direct response to the centuries of financial failure we have discussed. It was a toxic legacy inherited from his great-great-grandfather, Louis XIV, the Sun King. He realized that France could never be a global power without a stable currency and a central bank that could manage the national debt. He abandoned the worthless paper Assignats and returned France to a hard currency standard with the introduction of the germinal franc. This was a stable silver-based currency that would remain the foundation of the French economy for over 100 years. By providing a reliable medium of exchange, Napoleon did something the Bourbons never could. He restored the confidence of the middle class and the international banking community. Before Napoleon took total control, the revolutionary government had already performed a brutal act of debt management known as the bankruptcy of the two-thirds. They simply wiped away two-thirds of the national debt, effectively telling their creditors that their investments were gone. While this was devastating for the lenders, it gave Napoleon a relatively clean slate. He used this opportunity to centralize tax collection, ensuring that every cent went to Paris instead of being skimmed off by local corrupt officials. He replaced the chaotic and inefficient tax farming of the old regime with a professional bureaucracy of auditors and collectors. But Napoleon's most radical economic innovation was his business model for war. For over 70 years, Louis XIV had transformed France into the cultural and military center of the world. For the Bourbon kings, war was a massive expense that led to bankruptcy. For Napoleon, war was a profit center. As his grand army marched across Europe, they did not just win battles. They seized national treasuries, looted gold, and imposed massive financial indemnities on conquered nations like Austria and Prussia. Napoleon made war pay for war. He turned the French military into a giant extraction machine that funneled the wealth of Europe back into the vaults of the Bank of France. In 1803, Napoleon made one of the most famous financial decisions in history. To fund his planned invasion of Great Britain, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. To the Americans, it was the greatest real estate deal in history. To Napoleon, it was a quick cash injection of 80 million francs that allowed him to avoid raising taxes on the French people during a time of total war. He was a master of using assets to fund his geopolitical ambitions. He built Versailles, a palace so massive it required tens of thousands of workers and consumed over 10% of the entire national budget. Napoleon Bonaparte did not just end the revolution, he institutionalized its economic consequences. He built a centralized, efficient, and militarized state that was finally capable of managing the debt that had started the fire in 1789. He was the ultimate debt restructurer, turning a bankrupt kingdom into an industrial and military superpower. But this stability came with a hidden price. His entire system was built on the necessity of constant victory and the continued looting of other nations. The moment the Grand Army stopped winning, the economic foundation of the Napoleonic Empire would begin to crumble, proving once again that a nation cannot borrow or loot its way to permanent prosperity. What can we learn from the ashes of 1789? If there is one central lesson from the economic collapse of the French monarchy, it is this. The true origin of great conflicts is rarely found in the speeches of politicians or the ideals of philosophers. It is found in the structural arrangements of the economy. The French Revolution was the inevitable consequence of a society that tried to build a superpower on a foundation of unpayable debt, a rigged tax system, and a hollowed-out middle class. But Versailles was more than a home. It was a gold cage designed to bankrupt the nobility and centralize power. The story we have explored today is not just a museum piece. It is a mirror. When we look at the Bourbon debt crisis, we see the same patterns that haunt the modern world. Today, the global debt to gross domestic product ratio has reached levels that would have been unimaginable to the bankers of the 18th century. We see modern central banks engaging in massive programs of debt monetization and quantitative easing that are disturbingly similar to the experiment with the Assignats. We see a growing gap between a global financial elite and a working class that feels the system no longer works for them. The economic Cold War between competing systems of wealth creation did not end with the fall of the Bastille. It simply moved into the digital age. If you doubt the facts presented in this video, I encourage you to look at the primary sources that historians have used to reconstruct this reality. Look at the Compte Rendu of Jacques Necker from 1781, where you can see the first masterclass in government accounting tricks. Read the letters of Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, who warned King Louis XVI that the first gunshot of a new war would drive the state to bankruptcy. While the world looked on in awe at the gold leaf and the Hall of Mirrors, the French treasury was quietly bleeding out. Study the work of modern historians like Simon Schama in his masterpiece Citizens, or the classic analysis of Alexis de Tocqueville in The Old Regime and the Revolution. These scholars have proven that the French Revolution was not a spontaneous event, but a structural collapse decades in the making. The tragedy of the French Revolution is that it took the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people to resolve a contradiction that was embedded in the system from the very beginning. The monarchy believed it could maintain its ancient privileges while competing in a modern capitalist world. The revolutionaries believed they could print their way to prosperity. Both were wrong. The wealth that was extracted from the French peasantry and the enslaved people of the Caribbean was never truly returned. It was simply redistributed among a new class of financial speculators and military leaders. History does not repeat itself, but as the saying goes, it often rhymes. The French Revolution teaches us that when the financial architecture of a nation becomes a tool for the few at the expense of the many, the resulting collapse will be total and violent. It reminds us that a social contract is only as strong as the currency and the credit that back it up. Between the construction of Versailles and a series of relentless global wars, the Sun King left his successors with a national debt of over 2 billion livres. If you found this deep dive into the hidden financial origins of history valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep digging into the dusty ledgers of the past to find the truth about how our world was really built. I will see you in the next video, where we will continue to follow the money and uncover the real reasons why empires fall. The story of the French Revolution is a story that has not truly ended yet, because the struggle to define the meaning of freedom in an age of debt is a struggle we are still fighting today. Thank you for watching. In today's terms, we are talking about a structural deficit that would terrify even a modern central banker. By the middle of the 18th century, France was trapped in a primitive financial system that was fundamentally broken. It is a clean version of history, easy to digest, and perfect for a high school textbook. While their rivals in Great Britain had revolutionized finance by creating the Bank of England in 1694, France remained stuck in the Middle Ages. The British could borrow money at interest rates of just 3 or 4% because they had a transparent system of public debt backed by Parliament. In contrast, the French king was viewed by lenders as a private individual whose debts might vanish the moment he died. As a result, the French crown was forced to pay interest rates of 6, 8, or even 10%. Imagine a nation trying to compete as a global superpower while paying double or triple the interest of its main competitor. It was a mathematical impossibility. To make matters worse, the way France collected its money was a masterpiece of corruption and inefficiency. The government did not collect its own taxes. Instead, it used a system called tax farming. The crown would sell the right to collect taxes to wealthy private syndicates known as the Farmers General. But here is the problem with that version of events. These men would pay the king a fixed sum up front and then go out into the countryside to squeeze as much money as possible from the people, keeping the massive surplus for themselves. But the most fatal flaw in the Bourbon balance sheet was the tax exemption of the elite. In the late 1700s, French society was divided into 3 estates. The first estate was the Catholic Church, and the second estate was the nobility. Together, these two groups owned more than 35% of all the land and held nearly all the wealth in the kingdom. Yet, They paid almost zero in direct taxes. The entire financial burden of the largest nation in Europe fell upon the Third Estate, a group that included everyone from wealthy merchants and lawyers to the poorest peasants. By the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, 50% of the annual national budget was being spent just to pay the interest on existing debt. This was not a government. It was a debt management firm with a king attached to it. The French state was not just broke. It was unfixable under the current laws. It is not exactly wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. To save the country, the king would have to tax the rich. But the rich were the very people who ran the legal courts and the military. It was a classic stalemate of the ruling class, and as the interest payments continued to compound, the ticking clock of revolution began to accelerate. In the year 1778, the French monarchy made a decision that would change the course of human history. But they did not do it out of a noble desire for democracy or an abstract love for American freedom. They did it for revenge. After losing the 7 Years' War to Great Britain, the French elite were desperate to dismantle the British Empire. They saw the American Rebellion as a perfect opportunity to strike their rival where it hurt most. However, this act of geopolitical spite would come with a price tag that the French state simply could not afford. Historians often gloss over the sheer scale of the financial commitment involved. When you strip away the simplified moral drama and actually follow the money, you discover a reality that is far more unsettling. France did not just send a few ships and some gunpowder. They sent a massive expeditionary force, a full navy, and enormous direct subsidies. In total, France spent over 1,300,000,000 livres to support the American cause. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to feed and house over 7 million French citizens for an entire year. This was not a modest aid package. It was a total mobilization of French credit. But here is the detail that truly matters and is often misunderstood. Instead of raising taxes to pay for this war, which was the standard practice at the time, the French director of finance, Jacques Necker, decided to fund the entire conflict through new loans. He wanted to prove to the world that France could fight a global war without hurting the pockets of its people. It was a brilliant political move in the short term that made him incredibly popular with the public. The French Revolution was not just a spontaneous uprising of the oppressed, but it was a catastrophic economic disaster in the long run. Necker was essentially using high-interest credit cards to pay for a world war. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the Americans were free, but the French monarchy was functionally insolvent. France had won the war on the battlefield, but lost the war on the balance sheet. The interest payments on the American debt alone began to consume a massive portion of the national revenue. While the American founders were building a new nation, the French crown was struggling to pay back the international bankers who had funded the victory. This created a massive paradox. The French soldiers who returned from America brought back more than just stories of victory. They brought back the infectious ideas of republicanism and the right to overthrow a tyrant. But even more dangerously, they brought back a bill that could not be paid. It was the violent climax of a decades-long economic Cold War. The American Revolution did not just export the ideas of liberty to France, it exported a level of debt that made the collapse of the French throne inevitable. The revolutionary spirit was not just born in the streets of Paris, it was born in the massive deficit created by a war fought on the other side of the Atlantic. France had successfully helped create the United States, but in doing so, they had bankrupted their own 1,000-year-old monarchy. The American war dividend was not gold or land. It was a hollowed-out treasury and a ticking time bomb of sovereign default. As the debt from the American war began to suffocate the French state, the monarchy turned to a man who was unlike anyone who had ever held power in Versailles. His name was Jacques Necker. He was not a French nobleman or a military hero. He was a Protestant Swiss banker who had made a fortune in the private sector. Necker was the ultimate outsider, and in the eyes of a desperate King Louis XVI, he was the only man who could speak the language of the international banks and convince them to keep the money flowing. Necker understood something that no one else in the French government did, the power of public perception.